April 8, 1943, 30,000 feet above occupied Europe. The sky was clear, too clear. German fighter pilot Oberleutnant Ralph Hermischen leaned back in the cockpit of his Focke-Wulf, relaxed, almost bored. His oxygen mask hissed softly as sunlight reflected off the canopy. Below him, climbing slowly through the thin air, were shapes he didn't recognize at first. They were big, far bigger than expected. Hermischen squinted, then laughed. "These are what the Americans finally sent?" he said over the radio. "Flying milk bottles." Other German pilots laughed with him because the aircraft clawing their way upward were Republic P-47 Thunderbolts, massive, barrel-shaped American fighters making their very first appearance over Europe. To Luftwaffe veterans hardened by years of combat over Poland, France, Britain, and Russia, they looked absurd, heavy, bulky, slow, almost embarrassing. No one in the German formation felt even a hint of concern. What Hermischen didn't know, what no one in the Luftwaffe understood that morning, was that he was witnessing the arrival of the aircraft that would help break German air power beyond repair. By the end of this story, you'll understand how a plane everyone mocked became the sound German pilots feared most. But before we get there, consider this question and hold it in your mind. How does an aircraft everyone laughs at, one that kills its own pilots during training, one that seems inferior to its enemy in almost every measurable way, end up rewriting the rules of air warfare? And if you appreciate deep, cinematic war stories like this, take a second to like the video. It signals to the algorithm that this story matters and helps it reach people who care about history as much as you do. Now let's rewind to early 1943. American fighter pilots arriving in Europe faced an uncomfortable truth. They were late, very late. The war had already hardened the Luftwaffe into one of the most experienced air forces in history. German pilots weren't learning anymore. They were refining, perfecting, killing efficiently. The Americans, by contrast, had 0 combat days in Europe. And worse, their new fighter looked completely wrong. The P-47 Thunderbolt was enormous. Fully loaded, it weighed over 7 tons, making it the heaviest single-engine fighter ever built at the time. Its fuselage was so large, pilots joked it looked like a flying barrel. The wings seemed undersized, the propeller oversized, and nothing about it suggested agility. British pilots watching American units train were openly skeptical. One joked that the best evasive maneuver in a Thunderbolt was unstrapping and running around the cockpit. German pilots were less polite. They called it fat, they called it slow, they called it meat for the slaughter. At first, the numbers seemed to agree. In its earliest months of combat, P-47 units suffered heavy losses. They couldn't outturn the Focke-Wulf 190. They couldn't climb with the Messerschmitt 109 at lower altitudes. And in traditional dogfights, they were often outclassed. German commanders filed confident reports. "This new American fighter flies like a truck," one wrote. "It turns like a freight train." So what changed? Why did laughter turn into silence, and then into fear? To understand that, we have to go back to where the Thunderbolt was born, not in triumph, but in panic. June 1940. France collapses in weeks, German aircraft dominate the skies, Britain is barely holding on, and the United States Army Air Forces realize something terrifying. They don't have a fighter capable of surviving modern air combat at high altitude. Bombers were the backbone of American strategy, but bombers without escort were flying coffins, and existing American fighters simply couldn't protect them deep into enemy territory. The demand sent to aircraft designers was blunt. Build a fighter that can survive at extreme altitude, carry heavy armament, protect its pilot, and bring him home. At Republic Aviation, chief designer Alexander Kartveli read the requirements and did something no European designer dared to do. Instead of building a lightweight dogfighter, he designed something else entirely: a brute. "It will be a dinosaur," Kartveli reportedly told his team, "but a dinosaur with good proportions." The prototype shocked everyone. The XP-47B was 65% heavier than the aircraft it replaced. It was armored like a tank, built around an enormous Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine, and most critically, it used a complex turbo supercharger system that allowed the engine to breathe at altitudes where others suffocated. On paper, it was revolutionary. In practice, it was dangerous. Training accidents mounted quickly. The aircraft torque rolled on takeoff, ground looped on landing, and in dives pilots encountered compressibility, a terrifying phenomenon where control surfaces locked as shock waves formed on the wings. Between late 1942 and early 1943, the P-47 killed more American pilots in training than German fighters did in combat. Many pilots despised it. One said flying it felt like being strapped to a runaway locomotive. But those who survived long enough to master it discovered something crucial. The Thunderbolt didn't want to turn. It didn't want to dance. It wanted to fall. And that single realization changed everything. Early encounters taught German pilots exactly how they thought they should fight the Thunderbolt. Force turning engagements, attack from below, exploit its size. Yet something strange kept happening. Thunderbolts returned to base riddled with holes and still landed. Aircraft came back with dozens of cannon strikes, hundreds of bullet impacts, damage that would have destroyed any liquid-cooled fighter. The massive radial engine had no vulnerable coolant system. Hits that would have crippled a Messerschmitt barely slowed a P-47 down. German pilots noticed, they just didn't understand the implications yet. Then came the incident that changed perception forever. On June 26, 1943, Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson was returning from escort duty when Focke-Wulf 190s ambushed his formation. His Thunderbolt was shredded. Cannon shells smashed the canopy, hydraulic fluid filled the cockpit, and fire erupted behind the instrument panel. Johnson tried to bail out, but the canopy was jammed shut. At nearly 30,000 feet, wounded, half-blind, trapped in a burning aircraft, Robert Johnson should have died. But the Thunderbolt kept flying. A German pilot spotted him limping toward England and attacked again and again. Shells tore through the fuselage and bullets hammered the wings. When the German pilot finally ran out of ammunition, he pulled alongside the ruined American aircraft, stared at it in disbelief, shook his head, saluted, and flew away. Johnson landed in England with over 200 holes in his aircraft. Any other fighter would have disintegrated. This one brought him home. German intelligence dismissed the report until more arrived, and more. That was when the Luftwaffe began to understand something they had never faced before. The Thunderbolt didn't need to outturn you. It didn't need to outclimb you. It only needed to hit you once, because when it did, 8 synchronized 50-caliber machine guns unleashed 6,000 rounds per minute, converging into a zone of destruction no fighter could survive. By late 1943, German pilots stopped laughing entirely, and they were only getting started. What followed wasn't adaptation. It was transformation. Once American pilots understood what the Thunderbolt truly was, not a dancer, not a duelist, but a hammer, tactics changed overnight. Orders were rewritten, training manuals were thrown out, and the P-47 would never fight the war the Germans expected. Instead of turning, it dove. Instead of circling, it struck. From high altitude, Thunderbolt pilots used gravity as a weapon, climbing above German formations, sometimes 5,000 or 10,000 feet higher, waiting patiently, engines throttled back, eyes scanning the sky. Then the nose would drop, the aircraft accelerating faster than anything the Luftwaffe had ever seen. The massive weight that once made it clumsy turned it into a projectile. Speed built so violently that German pilots often never heard it coming before a burst of 50-caliber fire ended the engagement, and the Thunderbolt was already climbing back into the clouds before anyone could react. This tactic became known as boom and zoom, and it was devastating. German pilots tried to respond by climbing after the retreating Thunderbolts, but their engines choked in the thin air, superchargers screamed, speed bled away, and the Americans simply kept climbing. One Luftwaffe ace later described it as trying to chase a falling anvil back into the sky. Every failed pursuit made things worse, because the Thunderbolt wasn't alone anymore. It hunted in packs. High above, American formations waited like birds of prey. If one pilot missed his shot, another followed and another. German pilots found themselves under constant attack, never able to regain altitude, never able to reset the fight. Losses mounted, and still the Thunderbolt kept evolving. Engineers introduced the P-47D variant with a massive paddle blade propeller, dramatically increasing thrust, improving acceleration, and boosting climb performance. The aircraft that once struggled to reach altitude could now compete even with Germany's best. The laughter stopped completely. German pilots began to recognize the aircraft by sound before sight, a deep, rolling roar that echoed through the sky. Ground troops learned to fear it just as much. When Thunderbolts transitioned into the ground attack role, the war changed again. Bomb racks were added, rockets mounted, and the aircraft's already brutal firepower multiplied. One pass was often enough. Convoys vanished, rail lines twisted into wreckage, and columns of armor were shredded from the air. German soldiers coined a new term. Jabo, Jagdbomber, and the Thunderbolt became the most feared of them all. Doctors even documented a condition among German troops, Jabo-Schreck, fighter-bomber terror, as soldiers became physically ill when warned that Thunderbolts were operating nearby. And yet despite all this destruction, the aircraft still came home. Pilots limped back with wings half gone, engines shot through, control surfaces shredded, aircraft that should never have flown again landing safely. When the Thunderbolt arrived in the Pacific, it faced a completely different war. No long bomber streams over Europe, no endless clouds, no tightly packed formations of enemy fighters. Instead, there were vast oceans, brutal humidity, primitive airfields carved out of jungle, and an enemy whose doctrine couldn't have been more different. Japanese fighter pilots valued agility above all else, tight turns, close-in dogfights, precision, and finesse. Against aircraft like the Zero, the Thunderbolt looked even more absurd than it had in Europe. Too heavy, too fast in a straight line, too unwilling to turn. At first, Japanese pilots welcomed it, believing the Thunderbolt would be easy prey. They were wrong. Once again, the same misunderstanding repeated itself. The P-47 didn't fight the war it was expected to fight. American pilots quickly learned that trying to dogfight a Zero was suicide, so they didn't. Instead, they exploited the one thing Japanese aircraft lacked completely: survivability. Zeros were fragile, lightly armored, and highly flammable. The Thunderbolt was the opposite. When Thunderbolts attacked from altitude, Japanese pilots often turned instinctively, the maneuver that had saved them so many times before, and this time it killed them. A diving Thunderbolt carried so much energy that a single firing pass was enough. 150 caliber rounds ripped through thin aluminum frames, ignited fuel tanks, and shattered wings. Japanese pilots described Thunderbolts as unstoppable monsters, aircraft that absorbed hits and kept coming. When Japanese fighters tried to pursue, they couldn't catch it in a dive, couldn't damage it enough to stop it, and couldn't escape once it chose them. The Thunderbolt didn't just dominate air combat in the Pacific, it erased resistance on the ground. Low-level strafing, runs against airfields, supply depots, and troop concentrations became routine. The aircraft's heavy armor allowed pilots to fly through anti-aircraft fire that would have annihilated lighter fighters. Runways were cratered, aircraft destroyed on the ground, supply lines vanished, and island by island the Thunderbolt stripped Japanese forces of mobility and air cover. Once again the pattern repeated. Pilots survived, pilots gained experience, and pilots became lethal. Now pause for a second and consider this. What happens when an aircraft that refuses to die is paired with a nation that can build it faster than the enemy can destroy it? By mid-1944, the Thunderbolt wasn't rare, it was everywhere. Factories in the United States produced them in staggering numbers, thousands rolling off assembly lines, replacements arriving faster than squadrons could lose them. The Luftwaffe couldn't keep up, Japan couldn't keep up, and that imbalance changed the nature of the war itself. German pilots no longer fought for victory. They fought to survive missions. Japanese pilots increasingly resorted to desperation tactics. Meanwhile, Thunderbolt pilots flew again and again and again, each mission sharpening their edge. Here's the part most people overlook. Wars aren't won by perfect machines, they're won by systems. The Thunderbolt was part of a system that favored durability, repetition, and overwhelming pressure. It didn't need to be flawless. It needed to work every day under impossible conditions. And it did. By the time the war began to draw to a close, the Thunderbolt had logged an extraordinary record. Thousands of enemy aircraft destroyed, tens of thousands of vehicles eliminated, and critical infrastructure shattered across 2 continents. But its most important contribution was invisible. It kept pilots alive. Pilots who come home tell stories. Stories spread, and fear spreads. By late 1944, just the rumor of Thunderbolts operating in an area could halt movement entirely. Convoys waited until night. Units delayed attacks. Supplies piled up unused. The aircraft once mocked as a failure had become a psychological weapon. That raises a final question that ties this entire story together. Was the Thunderbolt successful despite being a failure, or was it successful because it rejected everything people thought a fighter should be? Think about that as the story moves toward its end, because the final legacy of the Thunderbolt isn't about speed, elegance, or even firepower. It's about philosophy, and that philosophy reshaped air warfare forever. After the war, the Thunderbolt didn't disappear quietly. It lingered not just in museums or history books, but in doctrine, design philosophy, and the way air forces thought about survival in combat. When analysts reviewed aerial losses after 1945, one pattern was impossible to ignore. Aircraft that brought pilots home produced better pilots, and the Thunderbolt had done that better than almost anything before it. Its designers hadn't built it to be loved, they had built it to endure, and endurance changed everything. Future aircraft would chase speed, stealth, and technology, but none would forget the lesson the Thunderbolt taught the hard way. You don't need to win every fight, you need to survive enough of them. That mindset carried forward into the Cold War. Jet fighters became faster and more lethal, but survivability remained a core principle. Armor, redundancy, self-sealing fuel tanks, ejection seats, all echoes of a philosophy born inside a flying barrel over Europe. But here's where the story circles back on itself. The Thunderbolt was never meant to be remembered as a legend. It was meant to be replaced. In American planning documents, it was a temporary solution, a bridge, something to hold the line until a real fighter arrived. Yet when veterans were asked years later which aircraft they trusted most, the answer was often the same. Not the sleek Mustang, not the elegant Spitfire, but the Thunderbolt. The plane that took hits meant for the pilot, the plane that came back when nothing else should have, the plane that forgave mistakes. That reputation didn't come from propaganda, it came from men who had survived. Now ask yourself something. If you were climbing into an aircraft knowing you'd be shot at, really shot at, which would you choose? The one that looked beautiful, or the one that refused to let you die? That question haunted German pilots, too. Captured Luftwaffe officers admitted that morale collapsed long before fuel or aircraft ran out. Facing enemies who could absorb punishment and return day after day broke something fundamental. You couldn't wear them down, you couldn't scare them off, and you couldn't rely on their machines to fail. The Thunderbolt flipped the psychological balance of air combat. By the time Germany surrendered, the laughter that once greeted the P-47 had vanished completely, replaced by resignation. In Japan, the lesson was even harsher. Fragile elegance had met industrial brutality, and brutality had won. So when people ask how a failed aircraft became the weapon that terrified the Luftwaffe, the answer isn't found in speed charts or turn rates. It's found in something far simpler. The Thunderbolt was built for reality, not theory, not pride, not aesthetics. Reality, and reality is unforgiving. If you've stayed with this story all the way through, you already understand something most people don't. Wars aren't decided by the most graceful machines, they're decided by the ones that show up tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that. That is why the Thunderbolt worked. If you want more stories like this, stories about weapons everyone misunderstood until it was too late, make sure you're subscribed. And if this story surprised you, leave a comment with one word: thunder. Because the laughter ended, the thunder spoke, and the sky belonged to America.